Mmusi Maimane, thanks again for your time. I want to pick up on this point that we were talking about, that your application in court is not just about the education sector, but also it's got to do with the country moving back to level 4 of the lockdown. We're now on level 3. I want to use the argument around hair salons. The president making a very compelling argument yesterday that you cannot keep that sector closed, particularly because you have in the majority women who work in that sector, and these are the people who are feeding their families at this time and rely on that income to feed their families. Again, this fine balance between saving lives, but at the same time, livelihoods. How do you argue with the president on that?
No, and again, as I say, our argument relates primarily to the increase in the number of people that end up in places of gatherings. So the economic argument is well made, and I don't certainly have a challenge with what the president is doing. But when you look at our application in the strict regulations of level 4, it had implications on what schooling would do. And therefore, we still maintain the fact that when you open up economic activity to the level that you are dealing with learners who are excluded and who have to be transported in the same transport, have to be now congregating in places where there are more bigger gatherings. Yeah. And we've never debated the fact that the government has a plan. All we simply are asking the court to do, which is quite urgent, is that it needs to give us a supervisory order. And despite my views on the president's opening up more of the economy, which I think is a necessary component, but I cannot deny the fact that it puts our kids at school. And our issue at core, that's why we're in court this morning, is always to argue strongly that in fact it's all schools must be safe. Otherwise, you end up in an environment upon which infections are rising. And what we're seeing in Gauteng, even in various provinces, is more and more schools being closed. All right. So you can't then de-link it to the hyperactivity that is now taking place in our country at the moment.
It's very interesting, Mr. Maimane, that you're saying that at the core of your application is a supervisory order on schools. In essence, are you saying that schools should not be closed again? All you want is supervisors to make sure that COVID-19 regulations are strictly adhered to, is it?
It's in two phases. The first was that the schools must be closed, obviously, so that we can make sure that the preparations are done. You will recall on the 1st of June, the minister declared that the schools could be open and then went ahead and said, no, they couldn't then be open, and waited 8 days later. Yeah. So when you look at the delay even in that, I have done an oversight over a number of schools and gone even one to last week, where when we got there, it became very clear that the school is not ready. They didn't have enough PPEs, they didn't have enough water and sanitation, the toilets were dysfunctional. So when you then put that cumulatively, as you are seeing right now in South Africa, more and more schools are shutting down because simply the school hasn't got the capability of looking after the very people that are gathering at that particular school. So we're asking for a period of time upon which the schools are closed so that all preparations are taking place, that a supervisory order be given so that the courts can be able to say the schools are ready, and then ultimately take all precautionary measures to make sure that we don't spread the virus in a manner that is uncontrolled and affect the lives of so many learners, teachers, and those who work in school institutions of education.
All right. The education, or schools in particular, did not get a mention from the president last night, and that then assumes that it is business as usual. Schools remain open. I hear your argument about the supervisory element. The other element, though, that we're not touching on is what medical experts have been telling us for the longest time now, that even if children do get infected, the impact on them of this virus is not going to be as severe, which is why it is fine for schools to reopen. Are you saying that their advice should not be listened to?
No, I think when I read the pediatrics report and a number of the other reports that are being put together, this particular argument pertains to primary school kids. We're discussing 16 and 17-year-olds sometimes 18-year-olds who are going into high school and writing matric. We're also discussing the very teachers that are having to teach many of these learners. So the cumulative effect, as we just look at two grades, grade 7 and grade 12 going back, and the teachers, has been a conservative number of close to about 3 million people. Now, here's the question. These are South Africans who then end up back in communities. So yes, a young person may contract the virus and be asymptomatic. But you and I know very well that they're going back into communities where they might live with a grandmother, they might live with a vulnerable citizen in this instance. So if we set up schools, as we've seen, for example, as I've been getting notices from educators saying they shut down these schools, the kids then go back into communities, and we simply are creating a way upon which the virus can be communicable from one environment to the next. So I think, to me, the risk isn't just what happens in the classroom, it's also what these young people end up doing when they go back into their communities.
And it's quite interesting that you raise the element of the differentiation in the age groups. Indeed, the primary phase, which is much younger children, experts have said those children are unlikely to be infectious. In other words, they're not going to infect mothers or grandmothers who may have underlying issues. So your point is taken there. But I want to conclude our discussion, Mr. Maimane, and ask this of you. Firstly, your prospects of success in court. I think you can already tell what government's attitude is as far as schooling is concerned. But I want to add a bit of spice to this conversation, if you will, that people listening to you right now, they might argue and say, really, what is Mmusi Maimane wanting to get out of this? Is this really about the care for the community, or is it about himself being relevant or remaining relevant after his departure from the DA? Is that part and parcel of the agenda here, to keep yourself relevant, Mr. Maimane?
Oli, I think one of the saddest things about our country, we reflect on June 16, 1976, recently, where it's become very clear that education in South Africa has still remained profoundly unequal. This is a government, and to your words, the president didn't even mention education yesterday, because I'm not convinced that actually this government cares about the education of South Africans, particularly poor South Africans. So if I wanted to make it just about myself, it would be easy. In essence, this is a conversation about us as a nation. Are we asking poor people to make a choice between going to school and contracting the virus, or staying at home and being uneducated? How is that any different to a time upon which we can say poor South Africans do not actually deserve an education in our country? Therefore, to a citizen who says my money is doing X, Y, and Z, I want us to reflect deeply on the fact that still today, our kids, particularly black kids, particularly poor kids, are still getting an inferior education. And therefore, where you are born is ultimately a determinant of what type of education you are going to get. If as a society we think that that is perfectly normal, then let us not in 10, 15 years' time, when we're grappling with many other issues of economic exclusion, say to ourselves that we did not foresee it coming when we continue to perpetuate the inequality as we see it today. This is a case for South Africa's reckoning. And what COVID has done, it has unmasked the degrees of inequality that this country has gone through. And we have to wrestle with them. If we fail to do so, and we say, no, it's a popularity act to come and contest these issues, then poor people will not have a voice. And I tell you, a nation is doomed when the consciousness of those who are included is silent to the plights of those who are excluded.
Mmusi Maimane, thank you very much for your time. The court case that he's pushing for will be heard at the North Gauteng High Court, and we understand that a full bench of judges will hear that matter.